You think you know what a bad day looks like? Let me tell you about Malachi Brooks, a man who thought his bad days were long behind him. He'd built a life out of silence, out of solitude, a quiet monument to a pain he never spoke of. But on this day, the silence was about to be shattered by the sound of 50 war cries, 50 Comanche warriors, on horseback. That's what Malachi saw cresting the hill at sunrise. Their war paint a series of angry, jagged lines against the soft morning light. 50 reasons for any sane man to either run or die. But 12 hours earlier, Malachi had no idea. He had no idea that saving one dying girl would put his entire world, his quiet, lonely world, on the very edge of a bloody, violent destruction. The evening before had been like any other. The sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Malachi was checking his cattle down by the creek, the familiar lowing of the animals, a comforting sound in the vast emptiness. He'd lived alone for 8 years, ever since the fever took his wife and daughter. 8 years of quiet days and long nights, with only the wind and the coyotes for company. Any human sound was a disturbance, a violation of the peace he'd so carefully constructed. That's when he heard it. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a call. It was a soft whimper, so faint it was almost stolen by the gurgle of the creek water. For a man who'd trained himself to ignore the world, this sound was different. It cut through the noise of nature, through the walls he'd built around his heart. It wasn't just the sound of someone in pain. It was the sound of someone dying. He followed the sound, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip, a habit born of years on the frontier. He pushed aside a cluster of mesquite bushes, their thorns snagging at his worn leather jacket, and then he saw her, a girl, collapsed on the dry, cracked earth. Blood, dark and sticky, was pooling beneath her small frame, a stark crimson stain against the dirt. She was Comanche, maybe 16 years old, with a raw, ugly bullet wound in her shoulder. Fever was burning through her skin slick with sweat despite the cooling evening air. Her breathing was a shallow, desperate gasp for life. Malachi's first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 8 years, was to walk away, turn his back, forget he saw anything, the smart thing, the safe thing. Getting involved with the Comanche was a death sentence for a white man in these parts. Relations were tense. A single misunderstanding could set the whole territory on fire. Helping a wounded Comanche girl? That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was an invitation to war. But he didn't move. Something in her face stopped him, held him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was how young she looked, how her cheeks were still round with youth, despite the pain that contorted her features. Or maybe it was the way her fingers clutched a small carved wooden pendant hanging from a leather cord around her neck. She held it like a prayer, like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. It was the same way his daughter, Sarah, used to hold her little corn husk doll when a thunderstorm rolled in, her tiny knuckles white with fear. Sarah. His Sarah would have been about this age now if she'd lived. The thought hit Malachi like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The past he'd tried so hard to bury was suddenly right here, bleeding out in front of him. He knelt beside the girl, the hard-won logic of survival battling with a flood of memories he couldn't control. He gently pushed aside the torn fabric of her dress to check the wound. The bullet had gone clean through, a small mercy. But infection was already setting in, the skin around the entry point angry and red. The fever was a raging fire. She needed help, immediately, or she'd be dead by morning, another forgotten soul claimed by the harshness of the land. He scanned the empty landscape, rolling hills, sparse trees, the vast, unforgiving sky. He was probably the only person within 50 miles who could do anything, the only person between her and the grave. And that's when he made the decision, the one that would change everything, the one that would bring the 50 warriors to his door. He lifted her carefully into his arms. She was so light, fragile as a bird. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, dark and wide with a primal fear. They were the same eyes his daughter had in her final moments, confused and frightened, looking to him for a salvation he couldn't provide. Then the girl's eyes rolled back, and she was unconscious again, her body limp, a dead weight of trouble and memory in his arms. Malachi carried her back to his small cabin, his mind a whirlwind. He'd built this place with his own two hands, a fortress against the world, a place to forget. Now he was carrying the most dangerous kind of trouble right through his front door. But as he laid her gently on his own cot, as he began to clean the wound with the last of his whiskey, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Not yet. He worked through the night, his hands moving with a purpose they hadn't had in years. He was using skills his wife Eleanor had taught him, her gentle voice echoing in his memory. Cleaning, stitching with a needle and thread sterilized in the fire, fighting the fever with cool water from the well. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, her lips moving, murmuring words in a language he couldn't understand, a language that was supposed to be his enemy's. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the gaps in his shutters, her fever had broken. Her breathing was even, peaceful. She was going to live. A wave of relief washed over Malachi, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had cheated death. He stepped outside into the cool morning air to check on his horses, a feeling of quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt useful. He felt like the man he used to be, and that's when he saw them. A line of warriors on the horizon, moving slowly, deliberately, a wave of death rolling toward his land. Even from a distance, he could see the glint of rifle barrels, the stark patterns of war paint, the unmistakable intent in their formation. They weren't just looking for the girl, they were coming for him. The girl's eyes snapped open the exact moment Malachi stepped back inside and bolted the heavy wooden door. The sound, the finality of it, seemed to jolt her from her slumber. She saw him, a tall, grim-faced white man in a cabin that was not her own, and a raw, animal terror filled her eyes. She tried to scramble away to get off the cot, but her wounded shoulders screamed in protest, sending her crashing back down with a sharp cry of pain. "Easy there," Malachi said softly, holding his hands up, palms open, the universal sign for peace. "You're safe." But her terrified expression told him she understood enough English to know that safety was a lie. A Comanche girl in a white man's cabin, with 50 warriors outside, was anything but safe. She started speaking rapidly in her native tongue, her voice a torrent of urgent, desperate sounds. She pointed a trembling finger toward the door with her good arm, her eyes wide and pleading. Malachi couldn't understand the words, but he caught one that he recognized from years of trading and border skirmishes. Numunu, the people, her people. Then she said another word, her voice filled with a particular kind of reverence and fear. Apu, father. Then she said something else, a phrase that made the hair on Malachi's arm stand up. Even without knowing the language, the urgency, the sheer terror in her tone was unmistakable. They weren't just in trouble, they were in a kind of trouble that had no easy way out. Malachi moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the shutters. The warriors had stopped about 200 yards away, fanning out to form a perfect, menacing crescent across his property. They weren't attacking, not yet, but they weren't leaving either. They were waiting. In the center of the formation, one man sat on his horse, taller, prouder than the rest. He wore a magnificent eagle feather war bonnet, a symbol of great status. Clearly their leader, the girl's father. "They think I took you," Malachi said, more to himself than to her. The logic was simple, brutal, and deadly. A missing daughter of a chief, a reclusive white man. The conclusion was foregone. "They think I'm holding you prisoner." The girl struggled to sit up again, and this time he helped her, propping her back against the rough-hewn wooden headboard. He saw her clearly now in the daylight. She was beautiful, in the way a wild hawk is beautiful, fierce, untamed, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through his lonely facade. But right now those eyes were filled with a fear so profound it was almost paralyzing. She pointed to herself and managed one word, "Ayana." Then she pointed to him, a question in her expression. "Malachi," he replied. It was the first time he'd said his own name aloud to another person in months. The sound of it felt foreign, strange on his own tongue. Ayana nodded, then struggled to find the English words she knew. "My father," she began, her voice raspy. She winced, then switched back to Comanche, speaking faster now, more desperately. gesturing toward the man in the war bonnet. Malachi didn't need a translation. He understood the situation perfectly. Chief Dakota, a man known for his ferocity and his deep-seated hatred of the whites, had probably been searching for his daughter all night. Finding her tracks leading to a white man's cabin would look like kidnapping, or worse. The fact that Malachi had actually saved her life, that he had sat by her side all night fighting the fever, wouldn't matter. Not to 50 armed warriors who'd seen too many of their people wronged by men with his skin color. A voice boomed across the distance, deep, commanding, speaking in Comanche. A voice used to being obeyed without question. Ayana's face went pale, a ghostly white beneath her sun-darkened skin. "What's he saying?" Malachi asked, his hand instinctively going to the rifle resting against the wall. Ayana looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. It looked like pity, pity for him. "He says, 'You have 1 hour,'" she translated, her English slow and careful. "Bring me out, or they burn everything." Malachi felt his chest tighten, a band of cold iron squeezing his lungs. An hour. 60 minutes. To figure out how to explain this impossible situation to a man who wanted him dead, in a language he didn't speak, with the only person who could vouch for him being a girl who could barely stand. The odds were impossible. Suicidal. But the real problem wasn't the language barrier. It wasn't the time limit. The real problem was that Ayana was trying to tell him something else. Something that made her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the 50 warriors outside. Something she couldn't find the words for. And whatever it was about to make this situation infinitely, horrifyingly worse. Ayana grabbed Malachi's wrist with a surprising strength, her fingers digging into his skin like talons. Her knuckles were white. Not my father," she whispered, her voice shaking so badly he could barely understand her. The words made no sense. He had just seen the chief, her father, leading the war party. "What?" he asked, leaning closer. "Dakota, he's your father." She shook her head violently, a gesture of pure denial. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She pressed her good hand to her wounded shoulder, her face contorting in pain and memory. Then she made a gesture with her fingers, a crude pantomime that sent a jolt of ice through Malachi's veins. It looked like someone holding a rifle, like someone shooting. "He did this," she choked out. The world seemed to tilt sideways. The solid floor of the cabin felt like the deck of a ship in a storm. Malachi stared at her, his mind refusing to process the implication. The chief outside, the man demanding her return. He wasn't here to rescue his daughter. He was here to finish what he'd started. "Why?" Malachi asked, the word a rough croak from his dry throat. He wasn't even sure she'd understand. Ayana's eyes, dark pools of trauma, filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke, each word a carefully chosen, devastating blow. I saw him kill white family." Malachi felt sick to his stomach. "Woman, children," she continued, her voice breaking. "He say, I tell no one, but I—" She touched the small wooden pendant around her neck, her fingers caressing the smooth wood. "I cannot stay quiet." The pieces slammed into place in Malachi's mind, forming a picture of pure, calculated evil. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a cleanup operation, an execution. Dakota hadn't been tracking a kidnapper. He had been hunting a witness. He had shot his own daughter to keep her silent about a massacre, and when she'd managed to escape, he'd tracked her here to finish the job. And the 50 warriors outside? They weren't accomplices. They were props, a stage setting for the lie Dakota was about to tell. They weren't just looking for their chief's daughter. They were being used to hunt down a witness who could destroy their leader, and by extension, their entire tribe. "That's why you were alone," Malachi said, understanding flooding through him like a bitter tide. "You were running from him." Ayana nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face, silent testament to the horror she had endured. I thought I could reach for, tell soldiers, but—" She gestured weakly at her wounded shoulder, the source of her failure, the reason she was trapped here with him. The voice outside boomed again, closer this time, impatient. Malachi risked another look through the shutters. Some of the warriors had dismounted and were moving forward, rifles held at the ready. They were losing patience. The hour was ticking away. "What's he saying now?" Malachi asked, his voice low and tense. Ayanna listened, her face growing even paler, if that was possible. "He tells them, 'You are the one who shot me,'" she whispered, the words filled with a sickening disbelief. "He says you took me to, to hurt me. They, they believe him." Of course they did. Why wouldn't they? Dakota was their chief, their celebrated leader, a man who had led them in battle and protected them from the encroaching white world. Why would they question his word against that of a reclusive, solitary white stranger? In their eyes, Malachi was the monster. Dakota was the grieving father, demanding justice. Malachi realized with a growing, suffocating horror that he wasn't just harboring a wounded girl. He was harboring the only witness to a war crime, and the man who had committed that crime was right outside his door, with an army at his back and a perfect story to cover his tracks. "There's something else," Ayanna whispered, her voice barely audible now, as if she were afraid the very walls could hear her. "The family he killed, they were not alone." Malachi's heart, which was already hammering against his ribs, seemed to stop altogether. "What do you mean?" "There were others," she said, her eyes wide, staring at something only she could see. "Other families. Dakota, he—" She struggled with the English, the complexity of the horror too much for her limited vocabulary. She gave up and spoke rapidly in Comanche, her good hand gesturing frantically, trying to convey a scale of violence that defied language. But Malachi didn't need a translation this time. The abject terror in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't about one massacre. This was about a string of them, a campaign of murder orchestrated by her own father, designed to look like something else entirely. And Ayanna was the only person alive who could expose it all. The voice outside grew louder, more demanding, laced with a righteous fury that was entirely fabricated. Malachi could hear horses moving, the click of rifles being cocked. The time for talking was almost over. That's when Ayanna said the 5 words that sealed both their fates. "He knows you know now." The sound of hoofbeats began to circle the cabin, a slow, rhythmic thunder that made Malachi's skin crawl. They were being surrounded, cut off from any possibility of escape. Through the window he could see warriors positioning themselves with practiced efficiency. 2 near the small barn, another by the well, more melting into the sparse tree line. Every angle was covered. It was a tactical masterpiece of death. Ayanna, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, struggled to stand, clutching the wooden bedpost for support. Her face was a mask of grim determination. "I go out," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I tell them. Tell them I ran here. You not hurt me." "They'll kill you the moment you step outside," Malachi said flatly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And then they'll kill me." "Better than both of us die here," she countered, her chin held high. Malachi shook his head. The girl had a warrior's courage. He'd give her that, but she didn't understand the monster they were really facing. "Ayanna, if Dakota's been killing families and covering it up, he can't let either of us live. It doesn't matter what you say. We're witnesses. We know too much." The truth of it hung in the small, dusty cabin like a death sentence. Dakota had painted himself into a corner, and the only way out was to paint over it with their blood. He couldn't let his daughter live to expose his crimes, and he couldn't let Malachi live to repeat what he'd heard. The only solution was to kill them both and sell the story of the heroic chief avenging his daughter, murdered by a savage white man. It was a perfect, tragic lie. A new voice called out from the line of warriors. It was younger, less certain, and speaking in broken, halting English. "White man, Chief Dakota, he, want to talk. You come out. Bring girl. No hurt you." Malachi almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it. "No hurt you." Spoken by a man whose 50 companions were ready to fill them with arrows and lead. But then he noticed something in the young warrior's voice. A flicker of uncertainty, maybe even a hint of doubt. "That's Koshi," Ayanna whispered, her eyes fixed on the door as if she could see through it. "He is good man. My cousin. He not know what Dakota do. An idea began to form in Malachi's mind. A desperate, long shot, probably suicidal idea. But it was the only one he had. How many of them know the truth about what Dakota's been doing? Just him, she said, her eyes darkening. Maybe one, two others. His most loyal. The rest? Ayana shook her head sadly. They think he protect our people from whites. They not know he kill innocent ones. That was it. That was their only shot, as thin as a razor's edge. If most of the warriors were in the dark, if they were honorable men who believed they were fighting for a just cause, maybe they could be turned. Maybe they would listen to reason if they knew their celebrated chief was a liar and a murderer of children. But first, Malachi had to figure out how to communicate that truth to 50 armed men who were currently convinced he was a monster. He moved to his gun rack, a simple wooden pegboard he'd built himself. He pulled down his Winchester rifle, its familiar weight a small comfort in his hands. He worked the lever, checking the chamber. 6 shots, 6 bullets against 50 warriors. The mathematics were not encouraging. What you do? Iana asked, a fresh wave of fear creeping back into her voice as she saw the rifle in his hands. Something stupid, Malachi replied with a grim smile. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron latch. But maybe stupid enough to work. No! Ayana grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. They kill you! Malachi looked at her. At this brave, terrified girl who had risked everything to expose the truth, who had run from her own father, who was still trying to protect him even as she was bleeding and weak. In her fierce, determined eyes, he saw the ghost of his daughter, Sarah. He saw the child he had failed to save 8 years ago. He wasn't going to fail again. Listen to me, he said, turning to face her, his voice low and intense. When I go out there, I'm going to try and tell them the truth. All of it. About what Dakota did, about what you saw. Some of them, maybe Koshi, might believe me. And if they not believe, she whispered. Malachi checked his rifle one more time, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. Then we make our stand here, together. He reached for the door, ready to face the impossible odds, ready to meet his fate. But Ayana's next words stopped him cold, his hand frozen on the latch. Malachi, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's something else. I not tell you about the families Dakota kill. The way she said it, the fresh horror that dawned in her eyes made his blood freeze solid in his veins. He thought he had heard the worst of it. He was wrong. Whatever she was about to reveal, it was even worse than everything she'd already told him, and they were about to run out of time to do anything about it. Ayana's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, each word a hammer blow against the crumbling walls of Malachi's composure. The families, one of them, had children, little ones. Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. Dakota. He'd tell the warriors they were killed by soldiers, a patrol that went rogue. But I saw him do it himself. Malachi's knees nearly buckled. He leaned against the rough log wall for support, the world spinning around him. Children. It was one thing to kill in battle, another to murder settlers in a feud over land. But to deliberately slaughter innocent children? What kind of man did that? What kind of monster? Dakota hadn't just murdered families. He'd butchered children and then twisted their deaths into a weapon, blaming it on the army to stoke the flames of hatred and justify more violence, more raids, more bloodshed. He was poisoning his own people with lies fed by the blood of the innocent. How many children? Malachi asked, his voice a rasp. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 3, she whispered. 2 boys, 1 girl. The girl, she was maybe 6 years old. Ayana's voice finally broke, shattering into a million pieces of grief and horror. She called for her mama when she couldn't finish. She didn't have to. The image burned itself into Malachi's mind, a portrait of unimaginable cruelty. The voice outside called again, sharp and insistent, no longer asking but demanding. Time was up. He keeps the scalps, Ayana continued. the words tumbling out in a desperate, horrified rush, as if she needed to purge the poison before they died. Hidden, in his lodge, he shows them to the young warriors, tells them it is proof that white soldiers kill our people, that they cannot be trusted. But I know the truth. A pure, white-hot rage began to build in Malachi's chest, a rage he hadn't felt since the day he buried his family. It wasn't just directed at Dakota anymore. It was for the whole sick, twisted situation. Those warriors outside weren't evil men. He knew that. They were husbands, fathers, sons, but they were being manipulated, lied to, turned into instruments of a monster's ambition, their grief and their righteous anger perverted to cover his own unspeakable crimes. If I could prove it to them, Malachi said slowly, the desperate idea from before returning with new force. If I could somehow make them see what Dakota really is. They never believe white man over their chief, Iana said, her voice laced with the certainty of despair. Never. But I was already thinking, my mind racing, looking for a crack in Dakota's wall of lies. What if it wasn't coming from a white man? What if the truth came from you? Iana stared at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and hopelessness. I am wounded. Weak. They will say you forced me. I am just a girl. They not listen to a girl. They'll listen, Malachi insisted, a spark of hope igniting in the darkness. They'll listen if you can prove it. He moved back to the window, studying the warriors outside. Most of them looked young, their faces taut with a mixture of anger and duty. They were following their chief out of loyalty and a trust that had been horribly betrayed. Tell me more about Koshi, the one who spoke English. Is he an honorable man? Yes, Iana said without hesitation. He is my cousin. He believes in honor. He would never knowingly hurt innocent people. Then we talked to him first, Malachi said, the plan solidifying, taking shape. It was still desperate, still dangerous, but it was no longer just a suicidal gesture. It was a strategy. We tell him the truth, all of it. We have to make him believe you. He will never believe such things about Dakota, she insisted. He will, Malachi said, his eyes locking onto hers. He will when you show him the proof. Iana looked completely confused. What proof? I have nothing. Malachi pointed to the pendant she still clutched in her hand, the small wooden carving she'd been holding when he found her. That belonged to one of the children, didn't it? The little girl. Her face went white. Her hand flew to the pendant, her fingers tracing its shape. How you know? Because you said you couldn't stay quiet, Malachi said, his voice gentle but firm, piecing it together. Because you're wearing their blood on your conscience, just like I've been wearing my family's for 8 years. That's why you were really running. Not just because you witnessed the murders, but because Dakota made you take something from the scene. Something to implicate you, to bind you to his silence with guilt. The sound of horses moving closer, more agitated now, interrupted them. Malachi could hear Dakota's voice clearly, speaking rapidly in Comanche, his words sharp and angry. Whatever he was telling his warriors, it was working them into a frenzy. He is telling them, I have hurt you, Iana translated, fresh tears of frustration and fear streaming down her face. He says I am probably already dead by your hands. And then they heard it, a sound that signaled the end of talking, the end of waiting, the beginning of the end. A war cry. 50 voices raised in a single, terrifying unison, a sound filled with rage and the promise of imminent, bloody violence. If you're enjoying this story and you believe that one person can still make a difference, hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about justice and revenge in the Old West. But Malachi had one more question for Iana, a simple question, and her answer would determine whether they lived through the next 5 minutes. Can you ride? He asked urgently. Iana tested her wounded shoulder, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain escaping her lips as the muscles protested. She winced, but her eyes were clear and focused. A little bit, she managed to say through gritted teeth. Why? Because we're not going out there to talk, Malachi said, his mind now moving with startling clarity. The time for words was over. The war cry had seen to that. Now it was time for action. He moved quickly to his gun cabinet, a sturdy wooden box in the corner of the room, and pulled out a box of ammunition and a second, smaller rifle, a Spencer carbine. We're going to the one place Dakota can't follow us with his lies. Where? She asked, her eyes wide as he pushed the carbine into her hands. Fort Davidson. He checked to make sure she could hold the weapon, that her grip was steady enough. It's 20 miles east of here. If we can get there alive, you can tell your story to the commanding officer. He'll have to investigate. And when they find those scalps in Dakota's lodge, Ayana's eyes widened with a dawning, fragile hope. But then the brutal reality of their situation crashed back in. 20 miles, through open country, with 50 warriors hunting us? It was impossible. A suicide ride. We've got one advantage they don't know about, Malachi said, moving to the back wall of his cabin. He reached for a section of the wall that looked just like the rest, a seamless facade of rough-hewn logs. He pulled aside a wooden panel, revealing a dark, gaping hole, a hidden door. This leads to a tunnel. I dug it during the Apache raids 3 years ago. Comes out in the ravine behind the ridge. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through, and it led downward into absolute darkness. It smelled of damp earth and fear. It wasn't comfortable, but it was a way out. A secret path that led right through the enemy's lines. My horses are in a hidden corral down there, Malachi continued, his voice urgent. Already saddled. We can be 5 miles away before they even realize we're gone. Ayana looked from the dark maw of the tunnel to Malachi's determined face, and then back to the chaos outside. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it was all she had left. And then, even if we reach the fort, who believed Comanche girl over a war chief? This was the final piece, the key that would unlock everything. Someone who knew those families, Malachi said, his voice turning grim. I recognize the description you gave of the children, the Hendersons. They were traveling through here about 2 weeks ago. A man, a woman, 3 kids, heading for Oregon territory. I sold them supplies. Good people. The war cries outside were getting louder, more urgent, closer. Dakota was working his warriors into a killing frenzy, feeding their anger with his poisonous lies. If those were the Hendersons, Malachi continued, his voice a low, intense rumble, then Captain Morrison at the fort knew them too. They stopped there first, registered their travel plans. When they never arrived in Oregon, he probably figured they died of disease or an accident on the trail. But if you walk in there, alive, and tell him they were murdered, he looked at the pendant in her hand. He'll have to investigate, especially when you show him that. Ayana looked down at the wooden carving. Malachi was right. It wasn't Comanche work. The style was too different, too delicate. It was a bird, a little dove, carved with a loving hand. It was something a white child would own, would treasure. It was proof. The sound of splintering wood ripped through the air. The front door. They were trying to break it down. They were out of time. Go, Malachi said, pushing her gently toward the tunnel. I'll be right behind you. Without a second's hesitation, Ayana dropped to her knees and crawled into the narrow, dark space. Her wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but she ignored it, clawing her way forward through the packed earth. Behind her, she could hear Malachi gathering supplies in a frantic rush. A canteen of water, more ammunition, anything they might need for the desperate ride ahead. The front door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood just as Malachi disappeared into the tunnel behind her, pulling the hidden panel shut. Angry voices filled the cabin, confused shouts in Comanche as the warriors found the room empty. Dakota's voice rose above the rest, barking orders, demanding they find them. They crawled through the suffocating darkness, dirt crumbling around them, the air thick and stale. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a coffin buried deep in the earth. Ayana's shoulder was bleeding again, the warm, sticky wetness soaking her dress, leaving a trail behind them. But she forced herself to keep moving, pulling herself forward with her good arm, inch by painful inch. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Dakota's voice, much closer than it should have been. It was muffled, coming from above, from the cabin. But then she heard it again, behind her, echoing faintly down the tunnel. They had found the entrance. Malachi, she whispered back into the darkness. I think they found the tunnel. She paused, listening for his reply, for the sound of his crawling behind her. But there was nothing, only silence. She looked back over her shoulder, but she couldn't see him anymore. The oppressive darkness had swallowed him completely, and the voices behind them were getting closer. Ayana burst from the tunnel exit, gasping for air, her lungs burning, her shoulder a single throbbing ball of fire. She stumbled into a small, hidden corral, exactly where Malachi had said it would be. It was a natural enclosure, protected by a ring of large boulders and thick brush, invisible from the ridge above. Two horses stood patiently, already saddled and ready to ride, their reins tied to a low-hanging branch. But Malachi wasn't there. She turned back to the dark mouth of the tunnel, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She listened, straining to hear any sound of movement, any sign that he was still behind her. Nothing. Only a heavy, pregnant silence. Then she heard it. Gunshots. 2, 3, then a fourth. Muffled by the earth, but unmistakable. They echoed from the direction of the cabin, followed by a chorus of angry shouts in Comanche. Her heart sank like a stone. Either Malachi was dead, or he was trapped, fighting for his life in that narrow earthen tomb. She looked at the horses, their powerful muscles twitching, their eyes wide and nervous. Then she looked back at the tunnel. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to take one of the horses and ride as hard and as fast as she could for Fort Davidson. She had the proof. She had the story. She could still expose Dakota's crimes, still bring justice for those murdered families. It was the logical thing to do, but she couldn't leave Malachi behind. Not after he had risked everything for her. Not after he had shown her a kindness she thought no longer existed in the world. He had saved her life. She couldn't abandon him to die alone in the dark. She was still frozen, torn between survival and loyalty, when she heard footsteps in the tunnel. Heavy, hurried, moving fast. Someone was coming. Ayana grabbed the small carbine Malachi had given her, the cold metal a shock against her clammy hands. She raised it, aiming it at the tunnel entrance, her arms shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. A figure emerged from the darkness into the dim light of the corral, a silhouette covered in dirt and blood. Malachi, she breathed, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. Thought I told you to ride, he said, his voice strained. He winced as he straightened up, one hand pressed against his side. Thought you were dead, she replied, lowering the rifle, her own voice trembling. Close enough, he grunted. He showed her a long, bloody graze along his ribs where a bullet had torn through his shirt and skin. They found the tunnel entrance right after you went in. I collapsed part of it behind me. Bought us maybe 10 minutes before they dig through or find another way around the ridge. There was no time for thanks, no time for anything but escape. Malachi quickly helped her onto one of the horses, his hands surprisingly gentle. He then swung up onto the other with a practiced ease that belied his injury. Can you hold on for 20 miles? He asked, his eyes boring into hers. Ayana nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. The blood loss and the searing pain were making her dizzy, the world tilting and swaying around her. But his grim determination was contagious. It kept her upright. It kept her focused. They spurred the horses, riding hard out of the hidden corral and down the rocky ravine, keeping low to avoid being seen from the ridge above. The horses were fresh and fast, their hooves striking sparks against the stones. But Ayana could already hear the sounds of pursuit echoing from behind them. War cries and the thunder of hoofbeats bouncing off the canyon walls, sounding closer than they were. They're coming, she called out to Malachi, her voice nearly lost in the wind. I know, he yelled back. He pointed ahead to where the narrow ravine opened up onto a vast, sun-drenched plain. Once we're out there, it's open country for 15 miles. No place to hide. It would be a race, a pure, simple, brutal race for their lives. 2 riders, one of them wounded, on good horses, against 50 of the finest warriors on the plains. Men who knew this territory like the back of their own hand. Men who were fueled by a righteous, manipulated fury. They burst from the mouth of the ravine at a full, desperate gallop. The morning sun blazed down on the endless grassland ahead, a sea of green and gold that offered no cover, no sanctuary. Behind them, Ayana risked a glance over her shoulder. The first Comanche riders were emerging from the canyon, spreading out immediately into a wide, sweeping formation, a hunter's net designed to cut off any and all escape routes. Faster! Malachi shouted, leaning low over his horse's neck. But Ayana's horse was already at its limit, its breath coming in ragged, heaving gasps. Her own strength was failing. The pain in her shoulder was a living thing, a fire that was spreading through her entire body. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She was starting to slide from the saddle, and that's when she saw it, far ahead. A dust cloud on the horizon, moving steadily in their direction. At first, she thought it was more Comanche warriors, a second party sent to cut them off from the east. Her heart, already pounding, nearly stopped in her chest. This was it. The end. They were trapped. But then, Malachi, who had seen it too, began shouting. Not in fear, not in despair. He was shouting something that sounded almost like joy. Blue uniforms, he roared over the sound of the wind and the hoofbeats. It's a cavalry patrol. Salvation was ahead of them, a line of blue-coated soldiers riding to their rescue. But the warriors behind them were gaining, closing the gap with a terrifying speed. They were so close now, Ayana could see the fierce, determined expressions on their faces. And the darkness was creeping in, claiming the edges of her vision, pulling her down from her horse, down into a silent, painless oblivion. The cavalry patrol was closer than it had first appeared. A dozen soldiers riding in a tight, disciplined formation. They were led by a captain with a weathered face and weary eyes that showed years of hard frontier experience. When they saw the two desperate riders being chased by a full-blown war party, they reacted instantly, their training taking over. They fanned out into a defensive line, their carbines rising as one, ready to unleash a volley of disciplined fire. "Hold your fire!" Malachi shouted, his voice raw and hoarse, as they galloped toward the line of soldiers. "We need protection, not a battle." The captain, a man Malachi recognized from his description as Captain Morrison, held up a gloved hand, stopping his men from shooting. "State your business, civilian," he called out, his voice a sharp, authoritative bark. "This girl has information about the Henderson family murders," Malachi yelled, reaching over to grab Ayana's reins, helping to keep her upright in her saddle as her strength finally gave out. "She's a witness to war crimes." Behind them, the Comanche warriors had pulled up about 200 yards away, clearly reluctant to charge headlong into a line of well-armed cavalry. But Dakota was visible among them, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage as he realized his prey was slipping through his fingers. Captain Morrison's expression changed completely at the mention of the Hendersons. The professional soldier vanished, replaced by a man whose face was suddenly etched with personal grief and anger. "Sergeant!" he snapped. "Maintain defensive positions. Get the medic over here. That girl's bleeding." He rode his horse closer to Malachi and Ayana, his eyes fixed on the young Comanche girl. "The Hendersons were friends of mine," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you know about their deaths?" Ayana struggled to speak, to force the words out past the pain and exhaustion. Her voice was weak, but it was clear and unwavering. "Chief Dakota," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the war party, he killed them. And others. I saw it happen." "That's a serious accusation, miss," Morrison said, though the look in his eyes said he already believed her. "She has proof," Malachi said, his hand going to the pendant around Ayana's neck, lifting it so the captain could see. "That belonged to one of the Henderson children?" Morrison leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he examined the small wooden carving. His face grew dark, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. "This is Emily Henderson's," he said, his voice a stunned whisper. "She showed it to me herself when they stopped at the fort. Her grandmother in Ohio carved it for her." He looked back at Ayana, a new and terrible intensity in his gaze. "Are you telling me Dakota murdered that entire family? The children too?" "Yes," Ayana said, her strength returning, fueled by the captain's belief. "And he has scalps hidden in his lodge to make his warriors think soldiers did it. He uses their anger to cover his crimes." Just then, one of the Comanche warriors rode forward from the group. It was the young man Ayana had called Koshi. He approached slowly, his hands held high and visible, showing he wanted to talk, not fight. "Captain," he called out in his careful, broken English. "My chief. He says the white man stole our chief's daughter. Says he hurt her." Morrison's gaze flickered between Koshi, Ayana, and the blood staining her clothes. "Is that true, miss? Did this man harm you?" "No." Ayana's voice was strong now, ringing with the power of the truth. "He saved my life. Dakota. He shot me when I tried to run, to tell the truth about the murders." Koshi's face went pale. The world he knew, the honor he believed in, was shattering around him. He spoke rapidly in Comanche to Ayana, his voice a torrent of confused, horrified questions. She responded in the same language, her words sharp and clear, cutting through years of lies. Morrison watched the exchange, noting how the young warrior's expression shifted from confusion to horror to a deep, burning rage. "What's she telling him?" Morrison asked Malachi quietly. "The truth," Malachi said, "about what kind of man Dakota really is." Koshi wheeled his horse around and rode hard back to the waiting war party. They could see him talking urgently with the other warriors, his arms gesturing wildly, first toward Dakota, then toward Ayana and the soldiers. An argument erupted. Several of the warriors began shouting at each other, their loyalties suddenly, violently divided. "Looks like not everyone's as loyal to their chief as he thought," Morrison said grimly. Suddenly, before the argument could resolve itself, Dakota broke from the group. He let out a furious, desperate war cry and charged, his horse thundering across the plain. But he wasn't charging the line of soldiers. He wasn't aiming for the man who had exposed him. He was heading straight for Ayana, the last witness. His own daughter. Morrison's rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final in the tense air. Dakota tumbled from his horse, hitting the ground hard and rolling to a stop just yards from them. The war chief tried to raise his weapon, his face twisted in a snarl of hatred. But Captain Morrison was already off his horse and standing over him, the smoking muzzle of his rifle aimed squarely at Dakota's chest. "Chief Dakota," Morrison said, his voice cold and formal, "you're under arrest for the murder of the Henderson family and for conspiracy to incite warfare through false testimony." Dakota spat a mouthful of blood and dirt onto the ground and spoke in Comanche, his words filled with venom and defiance. "He says you have no proof," Ayana translated weakly, as the army medic finally reached her side. Morrison allowed himself a grim, cold smile. "Tell him," he said, his eyes never leaving the defeated chief, "that we'll find those scalps he's been hiding, and when we do, his own people will finally know what kind of monster they've been following." 3 weeks later, Ayana stood in the makeshift courtroom at Fort Davidson. She was healed, strong, her voice steady as she gave her testimony. The scalps had been found, exactly where she said they would be, a gruesome collection of trophies hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Dakota's lodge. When the evidence was presented, what few supporters Dakota had left abandoned him. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. The trust between the tribes and the army, already so fragile, was shattered. It would take years and leaders like a newly promoted Koshi to begin to rebuild it. As for Malachi, he never went back to his isolated cabin. He was there for the trial, a silent figure in the back of the room. When it was over, he simply disappeared. Some said he'd moved east, looking for a fresh start in a place without so many ghosts. Others claimed they'd seen him along the frontier trails, a quiet, watchful man who had a habit of showing up exactly when travelers needed help the most. Ayana knew the truth. Some acts of compassion change everything. They don't just save the person receiving the help. They save the person brave enough to offer it, especially when the stakes are highest. Malachi hadn't just saved her. In that small, dusty cabin, she had saved him too. If a story of courage against impossible odds is what you come to YouTube for, then make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because the tales we have waiting for you are just as incredible. Now click on the video you see on the screen, because the next story carries something you can't explain, only feel. And when it ends, I promise you, you won't be the same. Click the video, now.